All right, so we're back to Thomas Taylor's dissertation on the philosophy of Aristotle, and we're in a quote by Simplicius discussing the nature of matter, whether matter is body or is something beneath the level of body. And Simplicius has established that Aristotle and Plato both held that it was beneath the level of body, not simply a type of body, or like the simplest possible body. Hello, Stephen, in the YouTube chat. Okay, so we'll pick up right where we left off. We've just reviewed those who did say that matter was some kind of very simple body, and then those, including Plato and Aristotle, who said no, it's beneath that level. Such, then, being the arguments on both sides, it is manifest that the subject to forms ought not to be form, on which account, if body is form, it will not be body. So, body will not be matter. However, that the nature which subsists in common in all things physical and sensible, so far as they are such, ought to be matter, is, I think, among things manifest. So the deepest common substrate of all things should be matter. But it is common to all these to be extended into bulk and interval. Hence, so I guess that leads to the confusion that the simplest body is matter, because all sensible things are extended into bulk and interval, and so is body. So, hence the science concerning nature, as Aristotle says, is conversant with bodies and magnitudes and the properties of these. May we not, therefore, admit that body is twofold, one kind as subsisting according to form and reason, and as defined by certain intervals, but another as characterized by intentions and remissions, and an indefiniteness of an incorporeal, impartible, and intelligible nature. This is interesting language. I'm not exactly sure what it means. So in one sense, body has the kind of mathematical properties according to form and reason, defined by interval, like mathematical interval, the dimensionality of body, perhaps. But another aspect of body characterized by intentions and remissions, and an indefiniteness of an incorporeal, impartible, and intelligible nature. Interesting. This not being formally defined by three intervals, being entirely remitted and dissipated, and on all sides flowing from being into non-being. Okay, so there is an intelligible, like a hardly intelligible, maybe this is intelligible by a spurious reasoning kind of thing, but a hardly intelligible, indefinite, incorporeal aspect of body, which has, I guess, attraction and repulsion would be more familiar language. And this aspect of body is not defined by three intervals, not three-dimensional yet, being entirely remitted and dissipated, and on all sides flowing from being into non-being. This is, I think, the same quantum foam type substrate between body and matter. We've seen it attested in several different sources now. So I think that's what Simplicius is talking about. Body has the rational dimensionality that it has, and it also has that attraction, repulsion, flowing from being into non-being. And yet it's that aspect of things is still an intelligible nature itself, because the intelligibles will flow all the way down beneath like definite body into the indefinite body. Maybe that's the best way to label the distinction. Definite body versus indefinite body. So you have definite body, then indefinite body, then matter itself, which doesn't, strictly speaking, have existence because it's not intelligible. Okay. Such an interval as this, we must perhaps admit matter to be, and not corporeal form. So he's calling that aspect of body characterized by intention and remission and an indefiniteness of an incorporeal, impartible, and intelligible nature. He's calling that, I guess, an interval. And he's suggesting maybe that is matter. Okay? Such an interval as this we must perhaps admit to be matter and not corporeal form, which now measures and bounds the infinite and indefinite nature of such an interval as this, and which stops it in its flight from being. Interesting. But it is worthwhile to know that it is proper matter should be that by which things material differ from such as are immaterial. But they differ by bulk, interval, division, and things of this kind, and not by things which are defined according to measure, but by things void of measure and indefinite, which are capable of being bounded by formal measures. Okay, this is a little bit tricky. So, it is proper matter should be that by which things material differ from such as are immaterial. I suppose that makes sense. Matter is what makes things material rather than immaterial. But they differ in being material from the immaterial by having bulk, interval, division, extension, things of that kind, not by things which are defined according to measure, because you can measure incorporeal forms as well, like pure geometric objects that don't have materiality, but by things void of measure and indefinite. So like indefinite bulk, indefinite interval, indefinite division, I guess, is what characterizes material things versus immaterial things. By things void of measure and indefinite, which are capable of being bounded by formal measures. Formal measures apply to immaterial too, so I guess this is supporting the idea that the not quite specified indefinite body is that by which material things are characterized. Their indefiniteness, their flowing into non-being, is because of that quantum foam substrate, and so Simplicius seems to be saying we can call that kind of quantum foam substrate matter, which in a certain sense I could get behind, in that matter itself is not even a real thing. It doesn't exist as a form of matter. It doesn't exist as pure matter ever. The bottom rung of existence, strictly speaking, will be this indefinite body beneath the level of measurable body, because pure matter doesn't itself even exist. It's a limit on being, not a being among other beings. And, okay, all right. So the Pythagoreans appear to have been the first of the Greeks that had this suspicion concerning matter. But after them, Plato, as Moderatus also informs us, for he, conformably to the Pythagoreans, evinced that the first one is above being and all essence. But he says that forms are the second one, which is true being and the intelligible, and that the third one, which is psychical, or belonging to soul, participates of the one and of forms. He adds that the last nature from this, and which is the nature of which is the nature of sensibles, does not participate, but is adorned according to a representation of them. Let's just go back to the beginning of the sentence and try again. Okay, which is psychical or belonging to soul, participates of the one in forms. He adds that the last nature from this, and which is the nature of sensibles, does not participate, but is adorned according to a representation of them. Okay, matter, which is in them, being the shadow of the non-being, which is primarily in quantity, or rather, depending on and proceeding from it. This is all very technical and interesting. So, he's saying, Simplicius is saying, Plato held that the nature of sensibles does not participate of those higher natures, but is adorned according to a representation of them. So I guess that's saying like the souls are really real beings and they participate directly in the forms, but then physical things, sensible things are adorned. And remember, cosmos also means adornment. So they're adorned according to a representation of them. So there's more like an emanation of a similar nature that the physical things receive, whereas souls maybe directly participate of those higher natures, but it's just a shadow of real being that actually makes the sensibles. Okay, matter, which is in them, being the shadow of the non-being, which is primarily in quantity, or rather depending on and proceeding from it. This is relevant for interpreting Simplicius and his statement about quantity there. What is the first of the accidental categories listed by Aristotle?
Substance?
No, the first of the accidental. Substance
Quality?
is first. No, so I guess actually quantity is
Quantity.
first.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
So that makes sense. Simplicius in his commentary on categories does say, and I always forget whether it's quality or quantity, but it's quantity that's first. And that means quantity has a prior subsistence to quality. And as we saw before, actually this might have been in the Porphyry. Ironic that we're running into Porphyry again right here, but in the Porphyry group, just before this, we were looking at... Give me a second to collect my thoughts. We were looking at how matter... actually, maybe we were reading it in this group. My thoughts suddenly just like scattered. So sorry to have to... Yeah. Sorry for you to have to deal with that. Let me just recollect my thoughts for a minute. But is adorned according to a representation of them, matter, which is in them, being the shadow of the non-being, which is primarily in quantity, or rather depending on proceeding from it. Okay, so that, like, flowing into non-being, there is the quantum foam-like thing that has indefinite interval, and it's in the shadow or image of quantity, because quantity is the most primitive kind of accidental property. Somewhere else we read that the accidents only apply to bodily natures. I think that was in Porphyry. So accidental properties, that is the 9 categories that Aristotle discusses besides substance, only apply for corporeal natures. So quantity, also Plotinus says that after like pure matter, which doesn't even properly exist, the first thing is magnitude. Magnitude is the next aspect to be added to matter. Magnitude plus matter equals mass. That's what Plotinus says. And so that magnitude, indefinite interval plus matter gives mass, that impulse and repulsion that is that quantum foam substrate. So that makes sense then why he's saying the shadow of the non-being, which is primarily in quantity, or rather depending on proceeding from it. So quantity is definite, but the shadow of quantity, its like lowest level manifestation, is that quantum foam substrate, impulse, indefinite interval, and that will be then what Simplicius is comfortable calling matter here. So this is really good stuff on that. I feel like I'm one of the only people like nowadays who's trying to pick up on this level of things. The indefinite matter that Plato discusses in the Timaeus and the Theaetetus, and that now Simplicius is discussing here, and that maybe Plotinus even is indicating in his essay on matter, that there is this kind of indefinite state that has repulsion, that has those properties, but not like rationally measurable yet. And that Simplicius is calling matter too. So, okay. Porphyry also, in his second book on matter, after adding the opinion of Moderatus, observes, quote, that monadic reason being willing, as Plato somewhere says, to give subsistence to the generation of things from itself, separated quantity according to a privation of itself, depriving it of all the reasons and forms which it contains in itself. Okay, so this does go back to Plotinus and Porphyry, and, of course, to Plato himself. But yeah, some monadic reason. So soul, I guess, because reason is generally translated from dianoia rather than nous. But the monadic, the highest principle of reasoning, the highest soul, is the one that generates generated things according to, by way of, a separated quantity according to a privation of itself, depriving it of all the reasons and forms which it contains in itself. So depriving quantity, the principal accidental category, depriving that, the first thing that will be applied on top of body is not yet rational. So by taking away, stripping away all the reason principles that are in soul, and just leaving the most primitive accidental property that can be there, that's how we get this matter that Simplicius just identified. This quantity he calls formless, indivisible, and unfigured. This is really great. Now I have multiple sources to elaborate that there is this level of the Platonic ontology, which the parallels to quantum mechanics are, JM and the Jitsi write the Quantum Platonica. No, totally. I mean, it's just so obvious they are talking about something like the quantum foam. This quantity he calls formless, indivisible, and unfigured, but receiving form, figure, division, quantity, and everything of this kind. This is still Porphyry. Or it should be. I thought... Yeah, this isn't written by Porphyry. I think we're missing a quotation mark here. There should be probably end quotes right here. Plato, too, says Porphyry, seems to have... so this is Simplicius now. Plato, too, says Porphyry, seems to have predicated many names of this quantity, calling it the universal recipient, formless, invisible, that it receives an efflux of the intelligible, and is scarcely to be apprehended by a spurious reason. Okay. Porphyry adds that quantity itself, and this form which is conceived according to a privation of monadic reason, comprehending in itself the productive principles of everything in the universe, are the paradigms of the matter of bodies, which, says he, the Pythagoreans and Plato call quantum, not quantum as form, but as subsisting according to privation, dissolution, extension, and separation through a mutation from being. Okay, we're going to read this sentence here again, just to make sure we're grasping everything. Porphyry adds that quantity itself, and this form which is conceived according to a privation of monadic reason. So quantity itself and this shadow of quantity, comprehending in itself the productive principles of everything in the universe, are the paradigms of the matter of bodies, which, says he, the Pythagoreans and Plato call quantum, not quantum as form, but as subsisting according to privation, dissolution, extension, and separation, and through a mutation from being. So it's strange then that he calls these things the paradigms of the matter of bodies. I guess this is a different use of paradigm, because it doesn't cause the matter of bodies, strictly speaking, in the manner of paradigmatic causation, which is from above to below, archetype to image, But instead, I think he's indicating that it is that material cause. I'm really kind of troubled by the language here because it seems like an inconsistency. But if we just read this as the material cause of that out of which the matter of bodies is made, then we can get along interpreting fine. In itself, the productive principles of everything are contained. So even in that state of pure potentia, this shadow of quantity, the quantum foam, the quantum, as Plato directly calls it, and the Pythagoreans apparently, this quantum holds the productive principles of everything in potentia, and it is the cause of the matter of bodies in the manner of material cause. I think that's the only way that I can find to sensibly interpret any other interpretations of this sentence, which seems problematic to me. Any other way to read it? I'll just wait a minute. Okay. So we'll go with my reading for now. Hence also, matter appears to be evil, as flying from the good. It is, however, comprehended by the good, and is not permitted to depart from its boundaries, extension receiving the reason of formal magnitude and being defined by it, but divulsion becoming specifically distinguished by arithmetical separation. Oh, there's the end quote. Well, then why does Porphyry's name come up here if this is a writing by Porphyry? Whatever. It was supposed to be Porphyry's opinion anyway. So according to Porphyry, in his second book on matter, which I doubt survives, according to Simplicius, Porphyry is saying that the Pythagoreans and Plato called quantum this kind of substrate that is also referred to as matter, which makes sense because it's the first matter that actually has subsistence. Okay, I want to read this sentence again as well. It is, however, comprehended by the good and is not permitted to depart from its boundaries, extension receiving the reason of formal magnitude and being defined by it. So form always goes down and limits that indefinite chaotic matter, but divulsion becoming specifically distinguished by arithmetical separation. So both the inward centrifugal bounding delimits matter, and when matter is divulsed from itself, that nature of the division becomes specifically distinguished by arithmetical separation and proportion, we might say. So the base level of things is trying to flow from being to non-being, but being the forms come down and continually measure that chaotic substrate. So that's pretty cool. According to this reasoning, therefore, back to Simplicius, matter is nothing else than the mutation of sensibles with respect to intelligibles, deviating from thence and carried downward to non-being. Okay, mutation, decline of sensibles away from intelligibles, deviating from intelligibles, carried downward to non-being. It is a movement of sensibles downward into non-being. Okay, and to just kind of correlate the quantum theory aspect, like Wolfgang Smith talks about the quantum realm being inferior to the classical realm. The classical realm exists first, right? Matter is the last of all things. So intelligible natures exist first, rational dimensional body, incorporeal dimensional body exists first, and then it is a departure from thence, a movement away, a privation from that carries downward into the quantum realm. So in other words, with quantum mechanics, the classical geometry precedes the quantum superpositions of possible states, and really the quantum, the probability distribution can only be defined rationally in terms of all of the various possible classical states that equate to it. And so in that sense, the quantum potential probability distribution is dependent on and is flowing away from the form of the classical state. So that's totally in accord with quantum mechanics, or at least some interpretation of it, with respect to intelligibles deviating from thence and carried downwards to non-being. For that the proper bulk of sensibles is one thing, formal magnitude another, the divulsion of sensible forms another, and arithmetical separation another, is evident from these being reasons and forms without interval and impartible. For the reason of tricubital magnitude, and also that of the triad, are without interval, impartible, and incorporeal. So the principle of tridimensionality, I don't know what tricubital per se means. Let's look that up. Tricubital. I don't think we're going to get. Trilobite came up. This is the issue with using Thomas Taylor, but all right. Well, of course, this is Taylor's work, so can't complain. But it's here we have Taylor translating Simplicius, using some old-fashioned terms.
3 cubits long.
That can't be it. Or maybe it's being given as an example. It could just be a for instance. So like the reason principle of 3 cubits magnitude, as also of 3, the reason principle of the number 3 are without interval, impartible, incorporeal. So once again, let's go back after the colon here. For that the proper bulk of sensibles is one thing, formal magnitude another, the divulsion of sensible forms another, and the arithmetical separation another, is evident from those being reasons, and forms without interval and impartible. For the reason of tricubital magnitude, and also that of the triad, are without interval, impartible, and incorporeal. Those things, indeed, which are the properties of sensibles, are irrational, corporeal, distributed into parts, and passing into bulk and divulsion, through an ultimate progression into generation, that is to say, into matter. For matter is always truly the last sediment, on which account also the Egyptians called the dregs of the first life, which they symbolically denominate water, matter, being as it were a certain mire. And matter is, as it were, the receptacle of generated and sensible natures, not subsisting as any definite form, but as the state or condition of subsistence, just as the impartible, the immaterial, true being, and things of this kind are the constitution of an intelligible nature. All forms, indeed, subsisting both here and there, but here, indeed, materially, and there, immaterially. Viz., there impartibly and truly, but here partibly and shadowy. Hence, every form is here distributed according to material interval. Let's just read. Sorry for all the repetition, but I don't think anybody is getting all of this on a first reading. And matter is, as it were, the receptacle of generation, or generated and sensible natures, not subsisting of any definite form, but as the state or condition of subsistence, just as the impartible, the immaterial, true being, and things of this kind are the constitution of an intelligible nature. So we were saying the attributes of sensibles are irrational, corporeal, distributed into parts, and we're saying the attributes of intelligible natures are impartible, immaterial, true being, all forms indeed subsisting both here and there. Here, materially and but here indeed materially, there immaterially, viz., there impartibly and truly, here partibly and shadowy. Hence, every form is here distributed according to material interval. Okay, so because of this pulling apart of matter, so that makes more sense then. Once we have this concept that the shadow of quantity doesn't give rational dimensionality, but it does give divulsion. We'll just call it attraction repulsion. I think that's a fair interpretation. So once the shadow of quantity gives attraction repulsion, then that leads to a kind of pulling apart of the impartible form, and as that's the flow from being to non-being. So that's why then the forms, as they enter down into matter, are pulled apart and given separation. That's why matter is treated as space, as that principle of separation, or principle of individuation. That was this is a very helpful section today. So going on with Simplicius, I believe. But how do these things accord with Aristotle and Plato, who are of opinion that matter is a certain subject to contrariety? Or may we not say that the assertions of others concerning matter tend in reality to an ultimate body? For there is not anything opposed to body, and thus it will be unbegotten and incorruptible, not only body celestial, but also that which is sublunary. So again, those who believe that body isn't a substrate to contraries, but is itself, or rather, maybe body is the substrate to contraries. I just said that wrong. So is some would say that body is the substrate to contraries, and insofar as it doesn't itself have a contrary, it's not going to be generating into anything else, because there's nothing for it to turn into. Contraries move to contraries. A body without a contrary would be unbegotten and incorruptible, even sublunary body. So maybe the atomists would fall in this camp. But let's see Simplicius respond to that. But the conception just now mentioned preserves also the corporeal interval of sublunary natures, together with extended form, as for instance with that of man or horse. Or shall we say that when what is generated is essence, mutation also is produced about material vicissitude, which always remains? For accidents are changed about essences, but essences about the quantum above mentioned of the Pythagoreans, either according to privation, or about the mutation from being, viz. About interval and material bulk. For air is generated from water, and qualities not only being changed, but also formal magnitude, since the magnitude on each side is different. Okay. And once again, we're going to go back here and just read this long sentence with the semicolons again. Or shall we say that when what is generated is essence, mutation also is produced about material vicissitudes? When what is generated is essence, mutation also is produced about material vicissitude, which always remains. Okay, so when what is generated is, I guess, let's just say by essence he means a substance in the Aristotelian sense, which may or may not be able to be inert physical objects. But physical objects, bodies like that, will have intelligible characteristics anyway, and so in that sense, that's like generated essence. But when what is generated is essence, mutations will always be produced about that material vicissitude, which always remains. So that's like the quantum foam. The quantum always remains. When essences are produced, formal properties, mutations from them, deviations from them will always be produced. And so we can account for the degeneration of sublunary bodies in that way, even if body per se doesn't have a contrary. For accidents are changed about essences, but essences about the quantum. So accidents... Oh, I see. Okay, so essences then act as a kind of substrate for contrary accidents that can instantiate in the essence or the substance in the Aristotelian sense here. So accidents can change between contraries within a substance, but essences, formal, like composite things, change about the quantum or quantum foam / matter of the Pythagoreans. and they are changed because of that tendency to flow into non-being and lose formal characteristics. So essences mutate about the quantum, accidents mutate about essences. So he's just explaining why even if body doesn't have a contrary, it can still be generated. All right, essences change about the quantum, either according to privation or about the mutation from being, viz. About interval and material bulk. So privation or about interval and material bulk. And now here's an example. For air is generated from water, the qualities not only being changed, but also formal magnitude. Okay. Since the magnitude on each side is different. So there can be a true privation, but then also a mutation regarding interval. So there can be subtraction of the real being as it flows to non-being, but then there can also be a change in the interval and material bulk in these elemental transmutations. All right, nor is the less a part of the greater, but each is a definite form, although material interval remains in both. Yeah, and think like the way Socrates addresses this in, I think it's actually in the Laches, for some reason, where he talks about how like 9 is not less than, he talks about like the relative magnitude of numbers and says that they are not greater than 7 because of 7 or because of 9, but because it participates of the greater. So the less and the greater are kind of independent forms. Each is a definite form, although the material interval remains in both. Okay, so the less is not just a part of the greater. That's not how Mariology works, I guess. The less is a form that things participate of. The greater is a form that things participate of, although material interval remains in both material greatness and material smallness. Interesting. For both are similarly material and are similarly divisible, sensible, and without difference according to matter, for differences are surveyed according to forms. Now, this is a big stretch, but I've thought before that like the quantum superposition state, the indefinite material state, may apply to both very small things and very large things, because the issue, and this is departing from Simplicius, this is like detouring into my own way of thinking about modern physics, is that if we're not in direct causal contact with a state, whether it's a very small state that doesn't impinge upon us because of its smallness, or like a causally disconnected state, like a space-like interval in relativity, or like the beyond the observable universe, we're out of causal contact with it, and so it's going to be in an indefinite state as well. So both are material, both the greater and the smaller. The material interval, that is the quantum, I think, remains in both. So again, just a big stretch, but it kind of concords with that idea that maybe the superposition state applies to the greater and the lesser. There's so much good stuff in these few pages, but okay. But that Aristotle had such a conception concerning matter, according to interval, and an indefinite quantum, is evident from what he says in the 4th book of this work, the Physics. For he there says, and this is from Simplicius's commentary on the Physics, by the way, he says in the 4th book, that by which place appears, let me try that again. That by which place appears to be the interval of magnitude, by this it appears to be matter, for this is different from magnitude. Okay, place, yeah, like Aristotle seems to reduce space to place, rejecting absolute space, but a closer reading of Aristotle's physics would be necessary to really confirm that. That by which place appears to be the interval of magnitude, by this it appears to be matter. So the interval of magnitude, like the quantum of place being the quantum of magnitude, and that quantum of magnitude prior to any definite shape, intelligible dimensional characteristics, will be matter as well. So here's just some evidence of Aristotle equating that quantum of magnitude with matter. For this is different from magnitude, the interval of magnitude, or the shadow of quantity, the quantum, will be different from quantity as an intelligible characteristic, I guess. And this is comprehended by form and is bounded, as it were, by superficies and end. So magnitude is bounded by form, no. What he's saying is the interval of magnitude, the quantum again, is itself comprehended by form, is bounded, and as it were, by superficies and end. So it's that quantum indeterminate state that receives the limitation of form and also gives the extension then to physical things. But matter and the indefinite are of this kind, being bounded. Those, however, who think fit to conceive of matter according to being, which is worse than forms, or according to the one which is the ultimate echo of the first one, do not, in my opinion, conceive rightly. Okay. So, I mean, I've used this kind of language as well, where the one extends to all things, including even to matter, and gives a unity to matter, even if it doesn't give being. So matter then has a unity that's not an archetypal unity in the manner of the forms, because the forms don't reach matter. It is without form. And yet, beyond the forms, there is the one, and so the one has its kind of reciprocal end in matter, which has a unity, but not yet an existence. But he's saying those who conceive that way don't conceive rightly. For being, when it is surveyed as nothing else than one and being, is properly and primarily that which it is said to be. But matter is the last thing, and is a departure from being, and much more from the one, and subsists in a mutation and deviation from being, since through the prolific power of being, it is necessary that a representation of being should have a subsistence. Okay. All right, so what Simplicius is disagreeing with is that we shouldn't think of matter as a being that is worse than the forms. It's not even a being, and it's not like a one that is an echo of the first one. For being, when it is surveyed, because if it was just one or just being, like that in its simplicity, it would just be the authentic one or the authentic being. But matter is the last thing, is a departure from being, and much more from the one, and subsists in a mutation and deviation from being. So he's actually agreeing with the Proclean conception of matter as privation. Since through prolific power of being, it is necessary that a representation of being should have a subsistence. So if it had real being, it would have the power that being confers, and it wouldn't be the end of the ontological hierarchy, but it's the last of things. And so the mode of its subsistence is through a departure, a deviation. It's a shadow from quantum, or from quantity, the quantum. So that's all good. From all that has been said, it is evident, as Simplicius well observes, that privation is not a certain nature, according to Aristotle, but absence in the subject which is naturally adapted to receive form. So privation isn't a certain nature, but is absent in the subject. So he's kind of Taylor now is reconciling the Platonic and Aristotelian notion of the first principles. It was said before, Aristotle suggested form, privation, and matter, whereas Platonists would say matter and form. But matter is that privation, and now here, according to Aristotle, that privation is an absence in a subject. So it's not an independent existing principle. It's an absence in the subject, which is naturally adapted to receive form. So that's the absence in the quantum of those intelligible characteristics. It's ready to receive intelligible characteristics. Hence, when privation is said to be accident to matter, it is not so said as if it were form, but just as it happens to anyone not to be in the forum. I'm going to read Karnik and JM wrote some messages in the Jitsi call. So Karnik, if we look, and this was a while ago, I didn't notice it. If we look at quantum, we shall find that the example which Aristotle gives of it is tripecus, tricubital, or 3 cubits long. Oh, I see, okay. A term quite as clearly relative as the term diplasios, or double, which he afterwards produces as instance of the category ad aliquid. Okay, so that's just justifying the interpretation we had before, that the tricubital was an instance, just an example. Okay. And then JM, I think of space as the information or relation, and placement as a particular instance of information in relation to what it isn't. Yeah, we could diverge into a general conception of space, but that would kind of be departing from the work. So let's finish interpreting this quickly, summarize it quickly, and then we'll JM, if you want to talk about that, we can. So last paragraph again, just to cap it off. From all that has been said, it is evident, as Simplicius well observes, that privation is not a certain nature, according to Aristotle, but absence in the subject which is naturally adapted to receive form. Hence, when privation is said to be an accident to matter, it is not so said as if it were form. So privation isn't a form, but just as it happens to anyone not to be in the forum. So, like, the fact of us not being in the forum is not a form that we're instantiating, not being in the forumness, but it's just not there. So that's fine. Just, again, agreeing with this Proclean conception of matter as privation. So going back, the general notion is that when the rational monad deprives itself of all possible intelligible characteristics, the last thing that is possible to get down to is the first of those formal properties, the category of quantity. So you will strip away all the intelligible aspects of quantity, and magnitude is like the basis or most principal element of the category of quantity. You'll get to magnitude deprived of its definiteness, deprived of any particular magnitude. So you'll get to indefinite magnitude, which gives mass. Matter and magnitude give mass, according to Plotinus. And that mass will have impulsion and attraction or repulsion, but not in a definite vector. It'll be this indefinite movement away. It's the subtraction from being. And so that's what gives then the impulse to push things apart. Principle of separation is that indefinite magnitude, indefinite impulse. And think loop quantum gravity, where space is based on a network of gravitons, essentially, or units of the gravitational force. And so space then would be characterized by a network of such primitive impulses. So there's a lot to work with here and to think about. But JM, what did you want to say?
I just wanted to ask, so when matter is said to be privation or non-being, do you think it's meant more so like its existence subsists entirely in the context of what actually is, or is it more like sensu stricto, non like yeah, like very like non-being in the very strict sense?
Yeah, it's not nothing, but well, think like in the sophist, the way non beings are treated as having a form of existence. If it was absolutely nothing, we couldn't even refer to it. So when we say the manner of its existence is by privation, we're not saying it's like totally nothing. That's like matter idealized as if it were a form. Matter could be thought of as pure privation, but like that doesn't exist that even as a non-being, but the way in which it is a non-being is as a local privation of these formal characteristics. That's the way that matter is what it is by subtracting these formal characteristics and leaving the minimum. So it exists as that pure potential for other form, pure receptacle for other form, and that's the mode of its existence. Just like evil subsists not by its own power, it doesn't. Things that have their own power have their own true existence. Evil doesn't have its own true existence, and so it only parasites off of good beings that have authentic power. That's where the power of evil comes from. So the mode of evil's existence is parasitical. So the mode of the existence of matter is privatory from the forms of the form of quantity. So it's privation of the form of quantity, leaving the absolute minimal criteria of existence, which will simply be this kind of attraction repulsion, quantum superposition state, and then it also functions therefore as a kind of receptacle for other possible other possible forms. So it's wholly receptive, and yet also productive in a way, not by its own power, but by the power that it derives from its intelligible characteristics. That's what gives it that the shadow of quantity is what gives it its attraction, repulsion, potential. So that was a little bit scattered, but that's as far as I can make sense out of it.
Okay, so that makes sense. Like the so it's like the otherness of being in the sophist.
Yes. Yeah.
Cool.
The otherness, non-being is compared to or reduced to the other in some sense. Seven Serpents in the YouTube chat. According to AI, Aristotle's term tricubital refers to the concept of 3 cubits, a unit of measure in ancient times. In the context of tricubital magnitude, Aristotle is likely discussing measurements or dimensions that are 3 times the length of a cubit. This term is used in his work to describe certain spatial aspects or quantities. Yeah, in the context in this work, it was just an example. He could have used any other random definite quantity. The point was that underneath that, there was the indefinite quantitativeness, I suppose. So, all right, we will end here. We'll come back with chapter 7, and I think this will be Taylor's actual text. But yeah, this was one of the most rewarding sessions in this work so far. I'm curious to see what else Taylor has to bring to the table. Most of the insights there were simplicious, but it definitely helped to clarify the doctrine of matter. So yeah, good stuff today. Thanks everyone for joining. Take care.